That's great. I'm very happy.
Are you listening?
Yes.
That's what I'm gonna do for you. God bless you, Jerry. But this is what you're gonna do for me. You listen, Jerry?
Yeah, what can I do for you, Rod? You just tell me, what can I do for you?
It's a very personal, very important thing. Hell, it's a family matter. Are you ready, Jerry?
I'm ready.
Just wanna make sure you're ready, brother. Here it is. Show me the money.
Hello, welcome. Welcome to She Became Visible. I'm René Steelman, your host, and I have a very special guest today. And we're going to get right into it because I think we're going to take up a little bit longer than an hour. I think you saw from my introduction that my guest today is Bryce Blackenangel. And Bryce is, in salutation to Bryce, I had to wear my shirt, Lazy Learner. I think that is absolutely hysterical because everything that I have learned about the true historical information about the Mormon Church, I have learned through study and research and through listening to podcasts from men like Bryce who have done hours and hours of research. And the thing that I love about listening to the ex-Mormon podcast world is that all of the research is historical. And the information that these podcasters get is taken from LDS church history. And I find that so amusing. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and it's one of those very confusing podcasts where they are fabulous historical research people, but they are hanging on to their testimony of the truthfulness of the church by a thread. And so the amount of research that they have done, completely proving that the church is not historically correct. And then but then they're quoting from the Book of Mormon to just hang on to dear life for their testimony. But I love it because they have so much information. And so we're going to bring you information today. So let me start out by just showing a little bit about what we're going to be talking about. So that's Bryce and I in the corner. And Bryce, I met Bryce at my first Sunstone in 2021, I believe it was. And I was like a fangirl. I was like, that's Bryce Blackenangel from Naked Mormonism, because I had listened to his podcast and he had so much information. And it was one of those constant what things when I would listen to his podcast, because one of the things that I learned when I listened yesterday was someone had done some research. I was looking for something in particular. And so I'm going through my Reddit and all of the other things that you search for. And someone said, I went through every seminary instructor's manual. I went through gospel doctrine manuals from the last 15 years. And not once was a rock in the stone mentioned, or a rock in the hat rather. And nothing about the seer stone. None of that was mentioned in gospel doctrine or in seminary. So when people say, you know, well, I don't know, it was published in The Friend in 1970. I'm like, well, I was a sophomore in high school attending seminary. Nobody taught me that. So I find that absolutely amazing. So if you have never listened to Naked Mormonism, you have to go back, and I'll talk to Bryce about that. It is absolutely, now you can't be too sensitive, because Bryce is who he is. He's not going to put on a charade of any kind. And so if you are very sensitive to F words or any profanity, then that might not be your cup of tea. But I love the humanity of Naked Mormonism. Kind of goes with the whole theme, right? Naked Mormonism. So Anyway, so what we're gonna talk about today is we're gonna follow the money, because like Bryce says, a lot of times if you follow the money, you're gonna find the true history and the whole true motivation. So we're gonna follow the money in Mormon history. And if we view everything in church history as all about the money, things begin to make a lot of sense. And Bryce points out that money and power go hand in hand, and that Joseph Smith's financial dealings were so complicated, even today, it's a tangled web. So that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. So I'll go back to this slide when I bring on Bryce. So good morning.
Good morning. Hello there.
How are you?
I am wonderful. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. I'm ecstatic to be here.
And just one more thing I wanted just to tell people too, that you are an independent Mormon history researcher and communicator. So you are not tied in with any group or college or anything like that. You are totally independent. You have done all your research on your own. And that, what would you say your purpose is really, you probably had the same experience I had, only you did it at quite a younger age, where the more you find out about church history, the more you're like, I got to dig deeper. This is fascinating.
Yes. That's my favorite thing about it is that it has kind of a magnetic feature to it. Once you begin studying it, and I know that we talk in the church culture a lot about catching the genealogy bug. That's oftentimes the thing when you're doing family history and you're building out these family tree lines and everything. It's really interesting, and then you just get addicted to it. Well, genealogy at its foundations really is family history research, and you are studying the history of your family or somebody else's family. And the bug is just the history bug, just wearing a different hat when it bites you with the genealogy. So it's fun once you kind of engage with it, once you understand like there's a lot of material here with which to engage, then it becomes a fascinating little world. And that is, being an independent researcher is something I definitely pride myself in, because the vast majority of Mormon history that's ever been written has been done by people who are believers in the church, or have a faith component to their writing, and they oftentimes come from the culture. And that doesn't mean that you can't trust what they say because, oh, they're just a Mormon, right? I'm just saying that people's motivations and their special pleadings and their cognitive dissonance can become apparent when you are just reading the text that they are writing. So the number of researchers that are independent within this field is very small, and unfortunately that means that a lot of people do have these philosophical or these financial ties towards institutions, oftentimes that are under the umbrella of Mormonism, whether they be the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or any of the the child descendant religions or the cousin descendant religions. Most of the history research has all been done by people who believe in the church.
Yeah, that's so true. And I love that, because that's where you start getting into the whitewashing, is when there's a financial tie or some kind of affiliation. I mean, I've been watching a lot of YouTubes on the whole Israeli-Palestinian debacle that's going on right now. And I discovered Norm Finkelstein, who I think he lost tenure, and he lost a lot of things just because of his view on Zionism and things like that. And so, there are a lot of LDS people that they don't have the financial ability to lose their tenure. Like, Dr. Michael Quinn lost everything when he, didn't lose his testimony, but he just thought he was just presenting historical facts, and he ends up losing everything, because of it. And there's a lot of people that aren't willing to do that. And so just because you have 45,000 initials behind your name does not give you honesty or integrity.
Correct.
It gives you, and I think that's where you get into the independent researchers that have absolutely no ties, no financial connections whatsoever. I'm just going to present to you what I have found through my research. And I love that. I think that's I think that's where you're going to find the truth. And your information, I mean, the diaries and LDS.org and church history and discourse and everything that you researched. The other thing about Naked Mormonism was it's scripted,
Mhm.
which means you not only had to do the research, but then you had to put everything together and write it all out in a very organized and presentable way for you then to verbally present it. That had to take hours.
Yeah, well, I have the luxury that being an independent researcher, when I decided to go full time into podcasting, I kind of put the ask out there to my listeners, like, "Hey, if you hire me on, I'll do this as a full time job." And they stepped up. They stepped up to the plate, and they said, "All right, we're going to hire you." And that gave me, a full time job's worth of time every day to devote to this work and towards writing. And once you boil it down to kind of a formulaic setup and kind of have the science of writing a script down and presenting it and everything, it becomes fairly formulaic, and it's just a matter of committing to it and doing it, and just sitting down and knowing that, like, all right, so here's the topic that I want to talk about this week, and I need to have my script by 5 pages by Monday night. It needs to be at 9.5 pages by Tuesday night. It needs to be at 12 pages and buttoned up by Wednesday night. It needs to be recorded by Thursday morning. It needs to be edited and posted by Thursday night. And then you start the next week, or repeating the cycle. I spend Friday and Saturday studying to find out what I'm going to be presenting the next week, and the cycle continues. So that it's obviously Naked Mormonism was a massive time suck. But it generated a ton of material, so that the Naked Mormonism is currently on hiatus while I kind of compile everything and put it into a book format. The struggle that I'm running against right now is that 200 plus episodes, all scripted. It's thousands of pages, and nobody's going to read a book that's 2,000 or 3,000 pages. So there's a lot of distilling that has to be done yet.
Interesting. Okay. And I love that you said that, because what we're going to be talking about today specifically is some of the financial entanglements that Joseph Smith got himself into, because I find it fascinating. Unless you know the past, it's hard to understand the present. And I think that's where people are running into problems, is if you don't know church history as far as their financial entanglements and even how they've got to where they are today. If you don't know that, then when something comes up, like with the M. Russell Ballard fiasco that's going on with Tim Ballard and the financial things, or some of the other things, like, for example, I just did a little thing where the church just bought a subdivision in Arizona, in an area of Arizona called Queen Creek. And it's going to be a rental area. So they're going to build like apartments or condos. The church owns the property, and they will own the buildings, and they will rent them out. And so it's like, why would a church build a subdivision? Why would they buy land? And so I started looking at it a little bit, and I found this article in 2014. And it's commercial real estate, promised lands. LDS Church controls thousands of acres across the valley. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the second largest church in the state. It also is one of the largest private landowners and real estate interests in the Phoenix area. The church and two of its wholly owned real estate groups, Property Reserves Incorporated and Suburban Land Reserve Incorporated, own and control nearly 5,400 acres spread across more than 300 parcels in Maricopa County, according to the county assessor's office. So you have to ask yourself, why would a church be one of the most prominent landowners, not only in the state of Arizona, being the second largest church in Arizona, but in the country? And I forget what the statistic is for the amount of land that they own in Florida. And I know they just bought a huge Amazon building in the UK, and they bought one in Seattle, and they're buying all of this. They're grabbing all of this land. And you think to yourself, why? What does that have to do with the teachings of Jesus Christ, or spreading the gospel of salvation, or helping the poor? Are we going to put homeless people in these buildings in Queen Creek? Because I'm 100% behind that if that's what the intention is. But so it's all about the money. Like I said with the Jerry Maguire clip, it's all about the money. And it started from the very beginning. If I was a singer, I would start Julie Andrews' song. It starts from the very beginning, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Because when people hear the thing about the SEC, or they hear about the thing with M. Russell Ballard, they're like, well, it's this is 2023, and this is just how things have to work, and we don't know all the details, and they might have made a mistake, and men are infallible, and all of this other brouhaha that goes on. So when I was listening, I was re-listening to your Naked Mormonism. You were only on episode 36. That's how early into your broadcast. It might have even been earlier than that when you started referencing the financial, how we're going to make this church into a financial institution.
Right. Of course.
Yeah. So let's get started. I'm going to let you share your amazing amount of knowledge, and I'm going to shut up. Start out like we talked about pre 1830. This is pre 1830, and you're talking about how Joseph Smith came from a very poor family. Yes. And so let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned that, and I remember hearing this in other historical podcasts that I listened to too, that when Lucy Mack Smith came into this marriage, she kind of had a dowry, right?
Yes, she did.
So tell us, let's start from there. Let's start from the union of Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, Lucy actually had family members who were somewhat wealthy. So she brought a dowry to the marriage of a few $1,000s, which was comfortable, which was enough for a person to get set up with a farm and be able to make their own way in the American frontier at that time. However, she also had a wedding present from a brother that was another, I believe, $1,000. So yeah, I mean, they had a fair amount of money coming into the marriage, at least. However, it appears from basically everything we can tell that Joseph Sr. Did not bring much to the marriage. He himself was fairly destitute coming into the marriage, and he continued that trend. He continued to be destitute the rest of his life. Which is to say that very early on, the Smith family, engaged in what's kind of, this ill-famed ginseng deal. And what happened is Joseph Sr. Had worked with a business partner who was attempting to sell some ginseng that Joseph Sr. had harvested and crystallized over in Chinese markets where they could command a premium for the ginseng. They harvested all of it, they crystallized all of it, sent it, but they never ended up seeing a penny from it. So Joseph Sr. kind of lost the family's wealth through this little get-rich-quick scheme, and then the family was kind of damned from that point forward into destitution. So that obviously the purpose of understanding that is to try and illustrate the kind of family dynamics and the dire straits, the beggarly nature of the early Smith family, because they definitely were in, rags. They were very, very poor by the time Joseph Smith is born into this family. And he's the fifth of 11 children, I believe it is. So, he's in a family that is already spread pretty thin with resources, and then they continue having more and more kids after him, and the family just gets stretched so thin. They pick up odd jobs, but obviously, very rarely are they ever working for, solid income that is reliable. Most of their money is coming from their odd jobs or the little businesses that they could start up. Lucy Mack was quite well known for her root beer recipes. And, when we drink root beer, that we were thinking barks or stuff like that. No, root beer, another term for that was small beers or soft beers, which is to say fermented root beverages. So those were apparently a hit on the during 4th of July celebrations, and she also did other work. She did palm reading as well. She painted tablecloths. So Lucy did quite a lot of contributing to the family to make sure that they did not get totally swallowed up into poverty. While Joseph Smith Sr. seems as if he was much more engaged in philosophical pursuits, and once in a while chasing the bottle. That was a charge laid at his feet quite often, was that he was a wino. He enjoyed his wine a lot, and he was out of the way with the wine all the time. So you kind of get this picture of this family, a lot of kids, not a lot of attention that the parents are giving to each individual kid for their nurturing as they're growing up. And of course, kids in large families tend to learn behaviors that gain them attention from their parents. And that's oftentimes bad behaviors, and then the kids get punished, or it's, sometimes it can be, good and stalwart behaviors. But other things, it can be just like eccentric personality traits and quirks that can cause the whole family to focus on one individual. And it appears that Joseph Smith was developed one of these character traits of telling stories and of being just a great talker, somebody who can just talk and talk and talk, and the whole room will listen. So that kind of sets the stage for the family that Joseph Smith is kind of maturing into. And obviously they're seeking anything that they can get, any little bit of money that they can get just for the next meal. They are not putting away money for retirement, right? These people are just barely able to scrape by a living. So one of the ways that they could get rich was, or they could get a little bit of money, was through treasure digging practices. And how the treasure digging practices worked was that the participants in the treasure dig, they either believe that the treasure is there, or they don't believe that the treasure is there, and they're committing a fraud. It really doesn't matter, because the end result is fraud nonetheless. But essentially, they tell a person that, hey, if you're looking for buried gold from Spanish conquistadors, or if you're looking for old silver mines from the Native Americans, if you're looking for buried treasure from Captain Kidd or whatever, that you can just dig, and you need a seer, you need somebody who can put a rock in a hat, and stare at the rock in the hat, and they can locate the buried treasure. But the person who is financing the dig, of course, is the person who gets the largest cut of the treasure once they find it. But they're financing the group of treasure diggers who are out there working every night. Joseph Smith, as the treasure diggers seer, he uses the rock in the hat in order to locate the treasure. And then other participants would cast spells, and they would try to bind the treasure to the ground in order to keep it from slipping further beneath their feet. And then others of them would dig, and it was a whole affair. And it turned out to be fraudulent. And that's one of the earliest things that we have about Joseph Smith that's not written about or by his family members. His glass looker trial in 1826. He was hired on by a guy named Josiah Stowell, and Josiah Stowell was faithful to Joseph Smith's magic powers. He totally believed that Joseph had the magic powers, and even joined the church after Joseph started the church. But in 1826, Joseph was doing treasure digs for Josiah Stowell. Stowell was financing this for a number of months, and Stowell's I believe it was his nephew, said, that Joseph Smith guy, he's bilking you out of money. He's just stealing your money. So he ended up filing a civil complaint against Joseph Smith on behalf of his uncle. And what's interesting about that is because when Joseph Smith was brought into the court and they had testimony, this nephew testified about his interactions with Joseph Smith and how he was able to, the fraud was so palpable, it was disgusting to him. But Josiah Stowell, the guy who was funding the treasure digs, who was there, who had lost the money, who had standing to sue, testified in behalf of Joseph Smith.
Right.
Which I think right there, that fact alone illustrates how powerful the mind control mechanisms can be when they are done by somebody who is intelligent and quick-witted and a narcissist and is looking to have all of the attention on them at all given times.
Well, and I think that's kind of one of the driving forces with wanting to do this topic today with you was to listen to, and I have a clip, I haven't decided if I'm going to show it or not, but both RFM and John DeLynn and a couple of other podcasts have really tried to stay on top of the breaking news for
Right.
the M. Russell Ballard, Tim Ballard debacle that's going on right now. And one of the things that is so startling is the amount of people who backed Tim Ballard, who gave him
Right.
financial support, who even when news broke that this was all a sham, they were like, there is no way. I know, I went on ops with him. I know. And so if you're familiar with that, but then you don't know the church history, just because, like you say, Josiah Stoll was there, he was paying these group of men, and there was nothing, they were finding no treasures whatsoever, but he still believed. And so you've got to understand these charismatic, narcissistic characters that people will back to their dying day. It doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean that what they were doing is right. And fortunately, with modern day technology and media and things like that, we're able to bring these things more forward. And I like what you said. It's amazing to me to see the replication of successful women. You've got Lucy Mack Smith coming from a financially secure family. You've got Emma Smith coming from a financially secure family. Both of these women had to step it up and do other things to try to bring financial security into their homes, because both of their husbands were out trying to do the anything that did not require work but was instant fast money.
Yes.
And you see that today. So that's absolutely fascinating. So that, like you say, even though his nephew, how many times have we heard this, right? My grandpa just got taken advantage of. Somebody just stole my grandpa's, and we tried to warn him. Or you've got the Dr. John series where this poor woman was taken advantage of. And you've got all of their relatives going, this isn't true. It's not true. And they're going, no, it was absolutely true. And that's exactly what was happening. It's just a repetition.
Well, I mean, I'm glad that you're kind of bringing it home there, and because you're talking about, what you're highlighting there, that's so crucial to how the narcissistic mindset works, is preying upon vulnerable people. And typically, generally speaking, people who are older generally have some liquid money, or they have some level of wealth built up that they are more likely, or more, it's more likely that they have money with which they can part. As opposed to somebody who was, Joseph Smith's age when he's doing these treasure digs, which is to say when, he was in his teens and his early 20s. And Josiah Stowell just was the first wealthy mark that we have good evidence of. That's not to say that this was Joseph's first wealthy mark. I highly doubt that. But it's also to say that this is the point where we can drop a pin and say we're establishing a pattern. We see Joseph Smith, who is accessing and honing in on the wealthiest members of the community, harping on or locating what their proclivities lead them towards, what drives them, what interests them, what ideologically motivates those people, and harnessing that motivation, harnessing that behavior, and channeling it into his own selfish goals. And that's just kind of the narcissist's playbook. And that's how Joseph Smith was able to start from a total rags story to, he died while he was candidate for the president of the United States. And now Mormonism is literally the wealthiest religion in the world. Yeah. So like there's obviously a lot of steps that get us from the slovenly Joseph Smith, dressed in rags, all the way to the corporate M. Russell Ballard, who is throwing around donors' names who have already given millions to the church, who would be likely to give millions to Operation Underground Railroad, right? There is a connective thread in all of this. And it just takes a lot of time to kind of establish the narrative of how it all went. But hey, that's what I'm here for, right? Like, people invite me on their shows to be a Mormon history dispenser and I just spit out the Mormon history, right? And it's my favorite thing to do. So I'm more than happy to continue talking about this. Once Joseph Smith is chastised in 1826 by the court, he's given leg bail, which is to say he was convicted, but then he was allowed to escape because he was destitute. He had nothing he could give. He was young. He, he wasn't a repeat offender as far as we can tell. This wasn't his, this was his first time in court. Therefore, it's, it went easy on him the first time. So he kind of shifted his goals from treasure digging to treasure digging. Because if we go through the history of the gold plates that form the foundations of the Book of Mormon, it's the same story. Joseph is out treasure digging. He prays to the spirit to try and bind the treasure to the spot, and then the spirit shows him the treasure, and he's not allowed to get the treasure, but he's able to see it. And then we have this, this legendary evolution over the span of 4 years until we get into 1827. And that's when Joseph supposedly gets the plates. He and Martin Harris start writing the Book of Mormon. And Martin Harris then gets cut out of the translation process. Martin Harris, of course, is the second person who we note is a wealthy mark, somebody who was in town, very credulous, a very zealous-minded person that Joseph honed in on and was like, hey, this is a wealthy guy. I think I can give him what he wants, and he'll give me what I want, which is money.
Right.
Martin Harris, the deal with him was a really sour situation. He took home a chunk of the manuscript that they were working on. It's known as the Lost 116 Pages. He wanted to show it to his wife, and his wife basically said, no, why would you give away all of your savings and mortgage your farm for this project? This is just stupid. Why are you doing this? Mm-hmm. But Martin Harris, nevertheless, he persisted, and she filed for divorce. I say good for her.
Yeah, no kidding.
And like there are a number of stories from individuals who were in neighbors that Martin Harris was an abusive guy. He was not a good person. I mean, he was apparently his weapon of choice against his wife Lucy was a bullwhip, the blunt end of a bullwhip. It's he's not a good person. So that is to say that, like, look, we shouldn't shed tears over this person, but what we should do is take notice that this person lost everything that they had, attached hitched their wagon to the Joseph Smith train, and was taken for a ride. And somebody like Joseph Smith comes along, totally bilks this guy out of everything he has. The guy loses his marriage, he loses his farm, he loses his home, he loses everything to follow the one true prophet.
Right.
And
then excommunicated, and then begs to come back eventually, and because he's lost everything. And it's it's amazing when you start delving into church history, like you listed here. And I love that you did this, because this is what I saw as I was reading history. I noticed reading, and I always get there's way too many Analyzas, and the names are just repeated over and over. How many Lucys do we have? How many, all this stuff. But if I remember reading the wife number 19, mm-hmm. She was the daughter of Edward Partridge, I think. Does that sound right to you? Am I getting that?
I don't think Analyza Young was a Partridge. No.
Was she the wheel making guy? The father did wheels for the wagons. I can't remember.
I do not remember. I've never read that book specifically because I haven't studied Utah history. And wife number 19 is kind of like one of the big bombshells of Utah. So I don't know enough about it to speak.
Her dad was I think they were in millinery, so maybe there was that kind of a thing. But he was wealthy and was doing really well, and then gets hooked up with Joseph Smith again, and loses everything, follows him out, to Utah. I can't remember. I think he died before they actually got out to Utah. But I'll have to remember that connection. But you've got Martin Harris, you've got Joseph Knight Sr., and this is when they landed in Kirtland, right? When they come across Joseph Knight, and they're like, "Hey, you prayed me here." Am I getting that right?
That Newell Knight, yes.
Oh, that was Newell Knight, yeah. And he's got Newell. Okay, and then you've got, because he was he had a store. He was
Yep.
a successful businessman. Joseph Smith's like ding, 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 ding. So he
Yep.
hooks onto him right away.
That
Then
was,
you,
I mean, literally the first person that Joseph Smith saw when he arrived in Ohio, right? And so, he meets with this Sidney Rigdon, and Sidney Rigdon had converted to the church. He meets Sidney Rigdon, and Sidney tells Joseph, "Hey, I got a congregation out in Ohio who would love to meet you, would love to hear your message." And they move out to Ohio, and Joseph commands the entire church to move to Ohio with him. And most of them follow. Most of them actually continue going all the way to Missouri, because that was the church's end game, of course, was Missouri. So yeah, then once Sidney Rigdon, he even brings along a wealthy guy named Edward Partridge, right? Edward Partridge was an heir of like a broom factory or something like that. And Edward Partridge comes along with Sidney Rigdon to meet Joseph Smith. So Sidney Rigdon brings a wealthy Mark to Joseph, who then Joseph is going to marry both of his teenage daughters later in Nauvoo, right? and he's going to attempt to marry Sidney Rigdon's daughter as well, who was a teenager in Nauvoo. That he has to ump the ante. He always has to be experimenting with how far he can push the envelope, right?
yeah.
That's way ahead of where we are. Anyway, so yeah, but when Joseph moves across, he jumps out of the sleigh and walks into the Newell K. Whitney store and says, shakes out Newell's hand. "You've prayed me here. What can I do for you?"
Yeah.
And it's kind of this iconic scene in Mormon history, because it's like, this is the foundations of the church in Kirtland. This is the first stake of the church. This is the first headquarters of the church, really. And Newell K. Whitney is somebody who traveled across the plains, who was a faithful Mormon until the day he died, right? So this is an iconic story in the tradition of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Brighamite Mormonism. And if not for him and John Johnson and Edward Partridge and a very small handful of other wealthy individuals, Joseph would have starved. The church itself would have starved. But these individuals come along, they throw money at Joseph Smith, and suddenly he comes up with new revelations. He's kind of he's a vending machine of revelations.
Yeah, and I love that, because I remember, like I said, years, and I mentioned this once before, years before the thought of ever not believing that this is the true church, I had stopped reading the Doctrine and Covenants, because there was something about how personal these revelations were, and people use that as an excuse to say, "Isn't this amazing? The Lord actually spoke to Joseph Smith about, Newell K. Whitney, or Joseph, this is for you, this is specifically for you." And I'm like, but yeah, they were always at Joseph's benefit. They were always like,
Always.
I just got this revelation. You're supposed to build me a house. And I was like, that's convenient, and it just, there was something about it that just said, you know what, it's best if I just don't read this. So when the third year came around, where it was Old Testament, New Testament, Doctrine and Covenants, Book of Mormon, I'd go, I'm just going to skip this year, because it was really, I just felt there was something wrong with it. And that's what I saw. I saw this pattern of taking advantage of hardworking, wealthy men that had established businesses. And even in the very beginning, listening to, Lucy's or Emma's dad, Hale, where he's like, something's off. I don't like this. This guy is not a good guy. He saw it. He could see that there was something wrong here. And so it's kind of like, why don't we listen to those guys? So you've got Edward Parker, who's Algernon Sidney Gilbert.
Right. Algernon Sidney Gilbert. Yes, he was another wealthy business owner. He was in a partnership with Newell K. Whitney, Newell K. Whitney ran the store in Ohio. And when they diversified and moved the church to Missouri, Algernon Sidney Gilbert actually went and built his store in Jackson County, in the city of Independence, Missouri. That building is still standing to this day. You can drive by it today. It's kind of known as, it's recognized, it's a currently functioning store, and it's recognized as a historic site in Independence, Missouri. But the Algernon Sidney Gilbert store still sits in Independence.
That's amazing. So then you've got John Johnson. Now there's a lot of Johnsons, right?
Yes. So the fame of the Johnson family is that Joseph and Emma were living with the Johnson family when they had just lost their twins, and they had adopted Julia and I can't remember the male twin's name. I'm sorry. The Murdoch twins. In any case, the male twin did not survive the night. But they were living there. Something happened, and a mob broke into the house in the middle of the night and dragged Joseph Smith out. They tried to poison him, but he wouldn't open his mouth. They chipped his tooth, and they attempted to castrate him, but the doctor lost his nerve, and then they just decided to resign themselves to tarring and feathering him that night. And many historians believe that it has something to do with Miranda Nancy Johnson, who was 15 at the time, I believe. That there was that possibly her brothers had found Joseph Smith and her. Obviously, the particulars of it, the situation, the relation dynamics with Joseph Smith, and all of the marriages that the marriages that he solemnized are very complicated and a much different topic than the financial woes of the church.
Right.
But it is important to note that this is one of the first signals where we likely find that Joseph is being physically assaulted due to his practice of non-monogamy.
Right. And you know what I found interesting too? When they drag them out of the house, and this is the tar and feather experience,
Yes.
right? And the story that we hear at church is all about Joseph Smith. It's all about how they tarred and feathered him, and then he goes back home and they're peeling the tar and the feather off of him, and he's like, by golly, you're not going to get me down. And so he shows up for church the next morning. That's the story that we hear. The story that we don't hear is that Sidney Rigdon was also dragged out, I believe tied to a horse. His poor head is bloop, 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 as he's being dragged behind this horse, creating even more brain damage than he originally had. And nobody's talking about that. No, everybody forgot to mention what Sidney Rigdon went through.
So specifically, the horse incident was actually when Sidney Rigdon was a child. That was his traumatic head injury. But when he was dragged out of the house, they dragged him out of the house and pulled him along the ground, and his head was hitting the frozen ground as they pulled him out. And then they beat him. They attacked him. Why they didn't physically beat Joseph Smith, I don't know. But Sidney Rigdon kind of got the short end of the stick here. But yeah, I mean, you have to recognize, right? Like, most of the people who were Mormons in Kirtland were people who were formerly members of Sidney Rigdon's congregation.
Yes.
And Sidney Rigdon brings Joseph Smith into town, and his people all convert to Mormonism. So, right, like the Johnsons were legacy members of Sidney Rigdon's church. So, what the situation happening there, why Joseph Smith got off with the tarring and feathering, and why Sidney Rigdon was actually beat. It's impossible to know. We don't know.
Yeah. And I remember I can visualize, I was on a hike. I'm listening to your podcasts. You're talking about Sidney Rigdon. And I did not know that he had brought this congregation to Ohio.
Yeah.
And, increasing, you go from like 4 people or 5 people, a member of the church, to all of a sudden you have a congregation of 200 and something.
Yep.
That's large. That's a large group of people. And so you're like, oh, that's interesting, and then you tie that in with bringing the members over from England who were in this industrial, poor people, and they're being promised land and wealth and
the American dream.
The American dream. And so they're coming over in droves, multiplying, just amazingly growing this city, overnight. And it's kind of like, we need to stop confusing the gospel and people joining the church with how they got there, why they got there, why the numbers grew. Had nothing to do. That's not right. I'm not saying it had nothing to do with it, but there was a soup. It was it wasn't just one thing. It was a soup of things that people went, okay, I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus. That makes sense. We've got a prophet. I believe in David and Solomon and all of these prophets. That makes sense. And how much land do I get? So there's it's a better life altogether. So it's so complicated. And I remember climbing up this and going, what? Sidney Rigdon did what? It's another one of those type things. So that's amazing. So then you've got Isaac Morley, Frederick G. Williams, and dozens of others within 3 years after the church was created.
Yeah.
So yeah, so you've got 1830 to 1834 had 4 revelations relating to church leadership being supported by membership. Now
Yeah.
we're talking
That's not
priestcraft.
much of a surprise, isn't it? Right. Well,
Yeah.
and that's what's funny too, is that like we talk about priestcraft in the modern culture of Mormonism, and that is any person who is paid for the craft of being a priest, which is say any preacher, any pastor, they all fall under the definition of priestcraft. And it's this boogeyman word, right? It's this big taboo, scary word,
Sounds
right?
like witchcraft. People think it's more
Yes.
tied into that. Yeah.
Exactly, right. And look, and I get it, right? Like I understand that, like, if if you have very simplistic notions of the world, it's like, oh no, this person's a preacher for God. They don't need money.
Right.
They're on a mission from God, right? No, like that's just a stupid way to look at things, right?
Right.
These individuals, they need money. The church leaders today are paid a stipend in addition to being paid for all of the boards that they sit on, all the projects, all the committees, all the whatever, right? We don't see what those paychecks look like, but they're
Right.
paid, right? So that's our modern definition of priestcraft. But the old definition, the 19th century definition, and the way that it's invoked in the Book of Mormon, is people who priests or religious leaders who would create doctrine that they wouldn't tell you what that doctrine is until you join their church and pay them for it.
Yeah.
That was what was known as the priestcraft, was that there's like that the religions are, they adhere to the Bible and so on and so forth, but that they have extra other special teachings that you don't get to know about until you become a member of the church.
That's amazing. Which is exactly what, a lot of these podcasts, the entire reasoning behind them is because that's exactly what the church is doing today. It's that milk before
Exactly.
meat mentality where, we're just going to tell you. I remember, and I shared this once before, I remember being a ward missionary, and it was just a mess. I mean, I've got 6 little kids at home, and my oldest is 9 years old. My youngest is has a lot of physical needs, and they call me to be a ward missionary. So I go out with these sister missionaries, and they're teaching these young kids over at the church. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got loads of laundry to do. I got to get dinner on tonight, but okay, what are we doing? And I said to them, why are we teaching these kids at the church? Why aren't you at their home? Oh, their father doesn't want to have anything to do with it. So the mother brings the kids over to the church. And I said, is the mother taking the discussions? And they're like, no, she just wants the kids to do it. And I'm like, okay, did you explain to her how this church works? Like, have you explained primary and young women's and young men's and tithing and having a calling, and how are they going to get to church and all? Did you explain? No, we haven't explained any of that to them.
Right.
And, and that was my whole thing, was like, nobody knows until you join. And now you're sitting with the bishop and they're going to talk to you after you've been baptized. Let's talk about tithing.
Yeah.
Let's talk about callings. And you're like, wait, what? What does that mean? You want me to do? Too late. You're on the records. That's exactly what you're talking about.
Priestcraft. That is the true priestcraft. And that's the definition that was used, or the way that it was understood at the time. And because Joseph Smith had his Doctrine and Covenants, it was originally the Book of Commandments, but he had, it became the Doctrine and Covenants when they included the doctrine part, that was the lectures on faith, into the Revelations, right? He had the Doctrine and Covenants was not well circulated. It was not, they didn't print very many copies of it. So when people who were investigating the church heard that the Mormon missionaries had their own very special book of revelations directly from God that they carried around, that they wouldn't show to anybody, their copy of Doctrine and Covenants, and instead they are just handing out these books of Mormon to all of the investigators, suddenly the Mormon missionaries were charged with priestcraft, because they had hidden revelations. They had hidden words from God that they would not show to anybody. And I know that this is even a conversation that happens with modern missionaries, that occasionally investigators will ask for a copy of the Doctrine and Covenants. And every time, it's like, I've heard a couple of stories of individuals that had this happen on their mission, that an investigator asked for a Doctrine and Covenants and they didn't know what to do. And it's a case-by-case basis what the stake or what your mission president wants you to do about that situation. But the Doctrine and Covenants is not for public consumption. It is for member consumption. And
Right.
it's also one thing that when I'm interacting with missionaries, one thing that I highly encourage missionaries to do is to read your Doctrine and Covenants. Read that book. It is the most important book of Mormon scripture. Because it's a history of the church. Like really, it's set up almost chronologically with a couple of blips, but it tells the history of the church through these revelations, through the mouth of God, right? Via Joseph Smith. And if you understand what those are, and more importantly, if you have open like the Joseph Smith Papers .com bio page of this person or their Wikipedia page, and that's how you're studying your Doctrine and Covenants, you're going to get so much more out of it. You're going to ask, wait, who is this person? Newell K. Whitney, this name is mentioned in the Doctrine and Covenants. Why? Who are they? Why is this person important? And that's very clear and very easy to see individuals who had revelations given to them that then like left the church or they died before the revelation came true. And it's like, wait, so God didn't have the foresight that this person was going to leave the church? Or wait, so God didn't know that this person would die before this revelation would come true? What? I highly encourage reading the Doctrine and Covenants, especially for faithful members, especially for missionaries, because it's approved of material. It's material that members study going every fourth year, just like you said, Renee. You have the 4-year cycle.
Yeah.
It's the most important book of Mormon scripture. I love the Doctrine and Covenants.
Well, and exactly what you said, and I think that's where my uncomfortableness came, was it is basically church history. And when you start to read it, you start seeing the church history and you start going, okay, wait, so then why did they go to Ohio? And so how did they meet this guy? And then they were living with them, like they didn't have a place to live, but then all of a sudden they got this revelation. That seems a little convenient, you know? And then if I would have been critical thinking at the time, I would have done exactly what you said. Let me look up this Newell K. Whitney guy. What was the context behind that? And that's where we've lost the context. And that's where Dan McClellan, when he talks about his biblical scholarship, you've got to know what else was going on at the time to understand this whole thing. But we don't do that. We just skip over that part. And we just go, oh, he was praying and Joseph Smith arrived. Okay, what's next? You know, we got to go from there. So, okay, so now we're in Kirtland. And we've got the revelation in 1832 commanding Mormons to build a house of the Lord dedicated in 1836. And it requires tens of thousands of dollars. And do we have tens of thousands of dollars?
We do not. No. So what's interesting is once Joseph gets to Kirtland, this is where he begins his period of experimentation. And I mean, I think it was experimentation in many ways.
I to do what I wanted. What else can I do?
Exactly. And look, in my opinion, from the research that I have done, and this is, you know, primary research. I do very little primary research. Most of my research is communicating research that other people who are much better at doing it than I have. But so right. Like I'm a Mormon history communicator first and foremost, right? But the little bit of research that I have done is the likelihood that psychedelics were being used in the early church in order to incite these spiritual phenomena and ecstasies that the early Mormons experienced. So I believe that this was a period where Joseph was experimenting with psychedelics in the sacrament in public settings. He's experimenting clearly with his marriage practices and the biblically approved of marriage standards and what he can possibly get away with. He's toying with expanding doctrine. He's coming up with D&C 76. Very importantly, he's making his own translation of the Bible, which is a huge project that he doesn't finish until, you know, he doesn't finish before he dies. But it's something that was very hot, something that was very much the market standard of the time, right? Look, just like, you know, podcasting, you have to view podcasting a bit of a market thing, right? It is, at the end of the day, there is an entire market that you need to consider, a lot of factors that go into podcasting. The same was the case with religion and is the case with religion, right? It was a very competitive scene. It is today as well, right? But the printing press became so democratized. You could buy for so little money such a wide distribution of your materials that the printing press became kind of the tool of religious zealots and of building up these iconic figures within the religious movements. And we have, Ann Lee with the Shakers, and we have Scott Campbell with the Campbellites, and we have William Miller in the Seventh-day Adventists, and we have like any of these prominent movements always had a printing press behind them that was churning out revelations, churning out newsletters, churning out scriptures, churning out whatever, just flooding the people with so much religious material that they are kept so busy consuming all of it, right? And like that's how it's just a statistics game, right? When you put out enough out there and you get far enough market penetration, you're going to get enough people who are self-selected to believe in your brand, whatever that is, who are going to glom onto the movement, who are going to glom onto the brand. And Joseph Smith recognized this very early on. He's establishing printing presses. That's one of his very earliest revelations, is telling Oliver Cowdery to go to New York to buy a printing press for the church so they can have a constant stream of propaganda being sent out, right? So the Joseph Smith is experimenting a lot in Kirtland, and one of these avenues of experimentation was in finances. And he was always bad with finances. He was always very terrible at keeping books and at paying people back for when he owed them money. And so oftentimes Emma was always picking up his messes. And oftentimes when Joseph was literally hiding in the closet or hiding in the corn stalks outside from creditors, Emma was the one answering the door with a kid in her arm. And like, oh no, sorry, my husband isn't here. You have to come back tomorrow, right? She is the one who's constantly picking up his messes. Surprise, surprise, right? So one thing that Joseph tries to do in order to expand his wealth in Kirtland is he commands all of the Mormons to dedicate all that they have to the church. And
where have I heard that before? Oh,
it's like, all of their time, all of their talents, weird, right? So they basically, Joseph creates the church as a communal trust that now controls all of the businesses, all of the homes, all of the wealth of all of the Mormons who opted into the United Order system. That's what this is known as the United Order, the United Firm. This is Mormon communism or communalism when it's on a smaller scale, right? And it fails. It fails. Because look,
as it always has,
right? You don't increase efficiency by putting a whole bunch of different unrelated businesses and smashing them all together in one big pot. That doesn't create more efficiency. What it does do is it funnels all of the wealth from all of those businesses into a fountainhead, right? And that fountainhead happened to be Joseph Smith and Cindy Rigdon. They became tremendously wealthy at this time. They had a lot of liquid capital, but they were also spending a lot of capital to build the Kirtland Temple, which you had a screenshot of the Kirtland Temple. I love that temple. I've been in it a few times, done the tour of it. I love that building. It's a beautiful building. And it represents a very fascinating era of this experimentation that we're talking about at Kirtland here. They went into so much debt for this building. Wow. I mean, somewhere in the ballpark of $40,000 to $60,000. And getting actual hard estimates on any of these dollar figures is extremely difficult to do. But if people need context, that's about in the ballpark of $1.5 million in 2023 money. And the Mormons weren't producing much. They didn't have any way to make that money back. All they had was Joseph Smith signing contracts for credit and him being extended that credit and him just taking that liquid money and throwing it away. Throwing it away into sometimes into projects, sometimes into stuff like the temple, but other times just partying. Like the dude liked to party. He liked to live the high life, and he had no income. His income was literally whatever people would give him in money. So, after a while of giving out another revelation that says, here, give me all your money, another revelation to give me, eventually he had to streamline it. And that's why he created the United Order, the Mormon communalism. It failed, and the way that they resigned to solve the failure of that was to create their own bank and just print their own money.
Right.
And that failed spectacularly.
Yeah. Let me interrupt here, because that's exactly another thing that I found out through one of your things was in this book, Sidney Rigdon, A
Yes.
Portrait of Religious Excess, written by Richard S. Van Wagner. He says, and let me just take this second here. Far West at its apex consisted of hundreds of log cabins, 4 dry goods stores, 9 groceries, 6 blacksmith shops, and 2 hotels. The schoolhouse where Sidney Rigdon preached shortly after settling in the area was moved to the center of the town square for use as a combination church, town hall, and courthouse. The Rigdon dwelling, a 2-story log cabin directly across the street from the town square, was the village's largest home. Upon leaving Kirtland, Rigdon lost virtually everything he owned, including 12 acres of property valued at $4,211. He rebounded financially in Missouri, however, quickly finding sustenance from church coffers. Mormonism's theological preoccupation with economics has been evident since the earliest days of the movement. The Book of Mormon implied that the rewards for righteous living included material wealth, while the work ethic, as by historian Michael Quinn, was communitarian rather than individualistic, and socialistic rather than entrepreneurialistic. Church leaders such as Rigdon, Smith, and later Brigham Young seldom went without. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. And one of the that I know after Joseph Smith died, and part of the whole thing with Emma was that everything was just combined. There wasn't a separation of church finances, individual finances. What the church was the individual finances. And Emma was like, you're not taking my stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. So I love Richard Van Wagner's book. That the Sidney Rigdon Portrait of Religious Excess is so good. His Book of Mormons is wonderful. It's a wonderful biographical compilation. He has a way with words, and he said it very explicitly, right? The fascination of Mormonism is money from its foundation, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, and with the whole the Kirtland Safety Society, which you had a screenshot there of some of the banknotes there from Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon on it. The older ones have the actual signatures of Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon as treasurer and secretary. But the Kirtland Safety Society, they attempted to get a bank charter, but the bank charter was denied. So they instead just kept printing the money and just sold them as society notes instead of as banknotes. And this kind of also coincided with a this was one way that the Mormons once again consolidated their wealth. They bought into the company store, then they owed their soul to it. And that is to say that once the valuation of these worthless dollars as paper money that they were printing became worthless, then a bunch of Mormons lost their retirement. They lost everything that they had. They lost all their material wealth, and they were mad. A lot of people were very mad at Joseph Smith and the church. There was actually a hostile takeover of the church by Warren Parish, known as the Parishite takeover. And they came in, and it was a huge brawl. Pistols fired off, Bowie knives were brandished. It was an ugly time, but there was a literal hostile takeover of the church meeting in the Kirtland Temple. And Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon were constantly arrested. They were constantly being brought into court and having judgments against them. They owed thousands of dollars to creditors. So they fled. They left town. They ran away. They became fugitives of justice because they refused to pay their creditor, or the people who they owed money to. Right. And they made it to Missouri.
You talked about who was it that told Joseph Smith that, hey, if you go back to Salem, in this house, in the basement, they had this silver. Yeah. And Joseph Smith, being the prophet and revelator and seer that he is, thought, oh, if I could go get some silver, then that would pay off all our debts, and then we would be, out of trouble. And so they sounds a little bit like M. Russell Ballard. And so they actually go to Salem, And the guy that told him about it was like, what house? I can't remember what house that was exactly. And anyway, they don't find any silver. And
Right.
while he's gone, and this is the Curlin time, right? While he's gone, like you were saying, there's like a coup. They're like,
Yes.
this guy is nuts and we're going to kill him. And Brigham Young rides out to meet Joseph and says, you better be prepared because there's people out here that want to kill you. Because
Yes.
they have, like you were saying, they've lost everything. They were followers of this prophet and they gave him everything that he said the Lord had commanded them. They've lost their businesses, they've lost their land, they've lost their property, everything's in debt. And so they're like, oh, we're just going to kill him,
Not to mention the Fanny Alger incident as well had happened.
Yeah,
Yep.
and that might be a problem. And so, like you say, so then he's like, as he's always done, oh, get out of town. You could do that back in 1830 something. You could just go across the border and you're safe,
No interstate police force.
Yeah. And I also love, and this is kind of a sidetrack, but what I also loved was when you were talking about in one of your episodes, you talked about the fact that they, one of the rituals that they were doing in the Kirtland Temple is this washing and anointing, and they're going in there and they're fasting and they're not eating, and then suddenly after 3 days they're like, bring us some bread and wine, and so they're starving, they're fasting, then they start drinking wine, and suddenly we're seeing Moses and Elijah, and we've had this whole vision. And it's like, unless you have that context, you don't put those two things together. It's like, was it a revelation or was it a hallucination? Because you're drunk, and you haven't eaten 3 days.
Right. And like we as Mormons are not programmed to think about the literal, like the physical chemical processes that cause us to have spiritual experiences when we fast, right? Cutting off your body from nourishment does all sorts of really weird stuff to your body and to your brain. Your brain engages in all sorts of survival mechanisms that are old, are instinctual, are located at the base of our spine, that your body does all sorts of things, and it puts you in a brain space where you are programmed to have experiences that you would not normally have if you were nourished. And then we engage in the ritualism, we engage in the praying, we engage in the washing, we engage in the going to church on Sunday and sitting and contemplating and praying and renewing our covenants and whatever the case is, right? So we engage in ritualistic behaviors after we are starving our bodies. That just means that we are increasing the likelihood that we'll have a spiritual experience. And of course, when you are adding in alcohol as a stimulant into that, which it's a vasodilator, it's increasing your blood flow, it's increasing your metabolism and the rate at which your body is burning calories that you don't have to burn. Especially if the alcohol, the wine, is consecrated or is adulterated with some kind of a drug, that's just going to be that much more potent, that much more effective on your body, because any nutrients that you're taking into your body while you are starving, your body uses those nutrients very first. It uses those nutrients quickly. So if you're also giving it psychedelics, mushrooms or whatever the case is, then your body is going to use that material very quickly. You're going to metabolize it very quickly. And suddenly you're going to see Moses and Elijah walking through the congregation. You're going to see the roof of the temple look like it's on fire. You're going to see angels swooping through the rafters. You're going to hear the sound of rushing mighty wind. You're going to have all sorts of extremely unbelievable experiences.
Right. That's so fascinating. And so I love that you're saying, DNC revelations included code names for various church leaders who were appointed to various positions in the various businesses.
Yeah, they had to conceal it because Joseph was clearly worried that if the United Order, the communalistic fund, ever came into the control of the court, then if they have these revelations suddenly that this person takes control of this because God said so, then that just proves that there is fraud, that Joseph Smith is administrating these things through fraud. So he instead contrived nicknames for the people, thinking that would legally insulate him. It did not. It did not insulate him. And in fact, as he was fleeing town with literally thousands of dollars of judgments against him, as Joseph was fleeing town, there was the Kirtland Temple, and then right next door to it was a 3-story business building of the church that held the printing offices, that held most of their records, their financial records, that held the schoolhouse where they had instruction, that had all sorts of uses. This is a multi-purpose building that was set ablaze. That had all the church's documents in it. The Kirtland Safety Society was run out of the basement of this building. That building was set on fire as Joseph and Sidney Rigdon were fleeing the scene. It almost burned the Kirtland Temple down, but the Bucket Brigade was able to save the temple, which is awesome. I'm so glad that they did.
Yeah,
but, yeah.
Was it set on fire intentionally to destroy records, or was it?
So we don't know. We know that it was on fire, and then we have a third-hand account from the son of somebody who said that his father stayed in Kirtland at Joseph Smith's direction to burn the printing press, or to burn the printing office down.
Okay.
But it's third-hand. It comes from the very early 1900s, and we know that person, Lyman Sherman, was in Kirtland at the time while Joseph was fleeing. But whether or not he actually did it, whether or not he actually committed the arson, or if it was just an accident that was very conveniently timed, we can't know for sure, but the facts seem to line up.
Interesting. Okay, so he's ran into multiple legal issues with ownership of businesses and terrible management, and people were leaving the church. And I think that part of history is also kind of whitewashed when they talk about the Whitmer family and all of the other people that said we've lost everything and we're done with this.
Martin Harris, the Pratt brothers, Orson Hyde. Yeah, I mean Martin Harris, all of them, right? All of them lost everything.
Yeah, and I think that isn't that the time that they compare the amount of people leaving the church today in comparison to that particular time.
The first mass exodus. Yes.
Yeah. And what's interesting is there's a lot of correlation there too, where there's knowledge and people are starting to go, I was duped. Yeah. I can't believe I was duped. I mean, it's the same story, the same reason why people are leaving. And so then you've got the Egyptian papyri and mummies bought for $2,500, which would be $90,000. Where the heck did they come up with that amount of money? That's a perfect example,
Great question, right? This is just one of those situations where Joseph thought that he had tapped everybody out, but then this Egyptian antiquities dealer came strolling into Kirtland, hearing that this boy prophet Joseph Smith knew how to read Egyptian through a stone in a hat, and he's like, I bet I could get some money out of this guy. So, good for you, Michael Chandler. This is an American dream. This is capitalism at its finest. Go bilk those people out of $2,500. And as he showed up, Joseph Smith said that these are important antiquities. And one wealthy or a couple of wealthy Mormons ponied up and said, yeah, all right, we do have a little bit extra stored under the mattress. We'll buy these, I guess.
Yeah.
And they did. Yep, they did.
And then how, I mean, like you say, so you've got other people that are paying for this. This isn't money from the Smith family. And yet Lucy now is going to hold the mummy and charge people to come in and see the mummy. So she's going to be making money off of this, not reimbursing the people that actually gave the money for this. That's an interesting concept.
That's correct. Yes.
Interesting. Okay. So now we're running into Missouri. And I love the thing too, that was it the Whitmer brothers that had a lot of, one guy was in charge of this congregation, one guy was in charge of this congregation. Everything was very well organized. Everything was running really well. And then Joseph Smith comes running into Missouri going, okay, I'm here now and I'm the boss. And everybody was like, yeah, but we've been running this for the last few years and it's really going well. And what about this position that I have? And so let's talk a little bit about that, because we don't hear that in Sunday school.
Yes. The Missouri church run under the Whitmers. It's David Whitmer and John Whitmer and Peter Whitmer as well, to a lesser extent. and William Phelps. The church out there in Missouri was doing fairly well. So when Joseph and Sidney Rigdon first met in the end of 1830, right? I'm going to try and put some timestamps on this just so we can have some kind of continuity to all of this, right? So Book of Mormon is published in April of 1830. Joseph and Sidney Rigdon meet in September of 1830 and join forces, a power couple, right? And then Joseph and Emma move out in February of 1831 to Kirtland. Now, Kirtland is this experimentation era that just spans from 1831 until the end of 1837, the beginning of 1838. It's this 6-7 year span here. During that time, Joseph had commanded all of the Mormons to move out to Missouri. Missouri was the frontier. That was the expansion, the westernmost expansion of the American territories at the time. And what's important there is that the government had stimulus packages or programs for people who are homesteading, where they could get land at basically a no cost or very, very low cost. If they were able to improve the land by the government's measurements, it was, put in crops basically and build a couple of buildings there. Then they would no longer owe the money to the government for the land. They would just then be homesteaded there. And that's how the American government worked in the 1800s, was they steal a whole bunch of money or land from Native Americans, kick them off of it, and then they provide incentives to get white European American settlers to settle that land that they had just stolen. And Joseph Smith was looking to capitalize off of this. So he commanded the Mormons to move out to Missouri.
And I think it's important that you put that in the context of what was going on in America in general, because I think sometimes when we're reading church history, we forget that there was a government and that there was a president of the United States and that these things were going on, like you say, the land grabs from the indigenous people. And so it's kind of like when people talk about the pioneers going west, they make it out like it was only the Mormons that went there because they were called of God. And we're like, no. Everybody was going there. So so this was a something that was set up by the government.
Well, it's also important to acknowledge the power and the signals that were sent when Andrew Jackson was elected president, because Andrew Jackson was a monster. He was a blowhard. He was old hickory, and he hated the natives. Absolutely. It had a personal vendetta against Native Americans. So when Andrew Jackson was elected president, this became a signal to the people that America was entering a phase of expansionism, which is to say that they were entering a phase where they would be more brutal on the natives because Andrew Jackson had essentially given them license to. And that came in the form of him campaigning and saying that we need to make America great. Basically, we need to expand it. We need to push the boundaries of the settlements of America. And in his inauguration speech, he made it clear that that was one of his objectives. And then one of his early acts was signing the Indian Removal Act, which liberated. That's very much the wrong word, which stole hundreds of thousands of acres from native groups in southeastern, current day southeastern United States. And removed them out to beyond the Mississippi, right? This is the borderlands. This is the borderlands where Joseph Smith was operating, right? So Andrew Jackson was elected in 1828. He signs the Indian Removal Act in 29 or 30, I believe it is. And then it begins being implemented in the following years after that. And then finally, when Jackson is about to end his 8 years as president, that's when that's when the Trail of Tears happens. So that's one of his final acts that he is, kind of sends off his presidency with, is implementing the strategy for the Trail of Tears, which was one of America's many genocides. It's one of the European Americans' many genocides against native cultures.
Right.
So Andrew Jackson being elected was a signal to all of the extremist, expansionist Americans that they were about to have a new era of expansion. And Joseph Smith decided that this was a good time that he could capitalize on this same thing. So it's important to acknowledge the political context, and this comes very much into play later when Joseph Smith himself is running for president, because he's running on a pro-expansionist platform. He wants to appropriate Oregon territory
Mhm.
from Britain. He wants to appropriate Texas. He wants to include Texas in the United States. He wants to expand and settle the territory that is, that was Mexico at the time. He wants to expand all the way to California. So he was very much of this mindset, this idea that America needs to expand and needs to continue growing. He also had some progressive ideas, which were he wanted to outlaw slavery. So good on him for that.
Yeah.
For the one thing, because it was politically popular, that one thing, he did the right way. But everything else, he was a radical of his time, because he wanted to not just expand the boundaries, but he also wanted to convert the Native Americans. He wanted to convert them to Christianity, like many people did at the time. But
Yeah.
it's important to note that, like, with Andrew Jackson being elected, that the largest potential and unrealized body politic and military power at the time were the non-confederated Native American oppressed tribes, right? Because they had been pushed for 160, 70 years by European American settlers from just the East Coast anyway. They had been pushed further and further west, and pushed into diaspora, and many of them dying, starving, diseased, and deliberately kept in those impoverished conditions by the agreements that they were signing with the white European Americans, right? So they were a huge block of unrealized potential power. And Joseph Smith knew this. Everybody knew this. If you could convert the Native Americans to Christianity, you could abandon or confederate them together, then that whoever was able to accomplish that, they stood to be the Napoleon of America. They stood to conquer America. They stood to overthrow the American government. They could do whatever they wanted, because there was millions of people at the time, hundreds of thousands of people, that they could confederate together in a political or into a military body.
Yeah.
Joseph recognized this, and the Book of Mormon states explicitly in the introduction that it was written for the purpose of Christianizing the Native Americans, for Joseph Smith's end political gains, to become king of the world.
Yeah, and it what I think is fascinating is the way that the church is taught to the youth, and then many of us, like you say, we grow up with this basic primary version of the history of the church, and we don't expand that at all, because we get so busy, which is very cult-like behavior, where they keep you busy, they keep you isolated, they tell you don't read anything, this kind of stuff. So you don't expand that knowledge from what you learned as a primary child from 12 and under. You don't expand that knowledge. So, when they tell you the story of like Brigham Young going out to Utah and, lifting himself up from the back of the wagon and going, "This is the place, I saw it in a dream." You're like, no. Then you find out, no, this was planned years ago.
Yeah.
And you weren't the only people going out to Utah on your way to Oregon, and, and everything else that was going on. And this was the soup that this is the water that everyone was swimming in at the time.
Correct.
So this whole idea that everything happened in a vacuum is like, no, everybody was going through this at that time. And that's what I love about the history that you brought out. So that's absolutely amazing. So now you've got Kirtland is in debt, mismanagement leading to defections, buying property, repackaging, and selling to Mormon members at a premium. I love that. Talk a little bit about what they did with that, because that was just like,
wow. Well, this was one of the big gripes that people had with Joseph Smith, and the reason that William Phelps was excommunicated was that Joseph Smith was buying up property. And it came to a head because he was doing it already. But once the Kirtland Safety Society was created, then they had these physical banknotes. This created a huge glut of liquid capital for Joseph Smith in the very short term. And what he did with that liquid capital was he bought up a bunch of land, and then he subdivided it and attempted to sell it, sub parcel it out to Mormons, and at an inflated cost. So this is just land speculation. This is common at the time. This is common today, right? How can I crack this lot to get 2 lots out of it, right? And make twice the money. Joseph Smith was good at this.
Wyoming temple thing, where this very wealthy Mormon has just donated some of his property, but he's also going to build a subdivision around the temple. And so it's like,
right.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Follow the money, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very much the case that Joseph Smith was doing this. He was making money off of the Mormons by buying land and selling it to them at an inflated cost. And when people called him out for it, he excommunicated them. William Phelps was, I believe, the first one who suffered the wrath of this excommunication because of Joseph Smith's financial dealings. Joseph wouldn't have any of that. He wouldn't hear any of that. And, you know, he did it in Kirtland. He did it in Missouri. And once, you know, once we kind of crossed the threshold, and something you said earlier, René, is that when Joseph got out to Missouri, the Whitmers and the Phelps were running the church in pretty good order at that time, and Oliver Cowdery as well. Joseph gets out there and he's like, no, this is my church. And they're like, no, this is the Church of Jesus Christ. This is not your church. And Joseph is like, yeah, no, it's my church because I got the Danites. And he signed the Danite Manifesto, or he didn't, you know, Joseph didn't personally sign it, but the Danite Manifesto was created that basically said that these individuals who were running the church in Missouri had 72 hours to leave town, or quote unquote, a more fatal calamity shall befall you. And they left town. They fled smartly. Yeah, but look, Joseph Smith was a bad man. He sicked his shadow enforcer, his shadow assassination squad on the leaders of his own church because they wouldn't relent and allow him to take power. And once they fled town, that's what he did. He and Sidney Rigdon took total power and total control over the Missouri church and used it to incite a civil war in the state of Missouri. And this is something Mormons are not taught about. They know about Liberty Jail. They know about Joseph's lamentations and his epistles from Liberty Jail, but they don't know why he was in jail to begin with. It's because he incited a civil war. He was being held on charges of high treason, larceny, organized crime, murder, arson, robbery. He had commanded the Mormons to go out to the non-Mormon settlements and raid and pillage them and burn the settlements to the ground and bring all the stuff back to the bishop's storehouse. He had commanded his guys to raid a military supply depot and steal a state-owned cannon. Right. And so the way that the Mormon rebellion was put down was by the superior forces of the Missouri militia surrounding the two strongholds. That's Far West and Adam-on-Diamond in Missouri. And Joseph Smith surrendering and the Mormons being forced to leave the state, and Joseph Smith and over 60 other church leaders being locked in jail for that entire winter of 1838 to 39, while the vast majority, 6,000 to 8,000 Mormons crossed the plains, crossed over the Mississippi, frozen Mississippi, and then landed in Quincy, Illinois, which set the church on the path towards Nauvoo. And Nauvoo becomes the kingdom on the Mississippi. It's when Joseph Smith truly realizes his theocratic end goals, and he's able to actually accomplish his great desires.
It's so fascinating because, especially with, like I was saying, what's going on today with the Zionism and this whole idea that this is our land, this is our property, that God told us that we need to live here. You guys get out, you know? And I think it was also one of your podcasts that talked about how the like you were saying, the settlement deal that was being worked out was like, all right, we're gonna treat you like we've treated the indigenous people. We're gonna give you, was it Davis County or Caldwell County? We're gonna give you that. You stay there. You just live there. Do your thing. Just leave us alone. You just do your thing. And just it's like, yeah, no. We're just gonna keep spreading out. We're just, you know.
Yeah.
And so it's like it's a constant barrage of illegal activity, and then they're going, why are you so mean? I mean, you put me in jail because I was doing all this illegal stuff. And it's like, that's not really fair. You know, I'm a prophet and God wanted me to do that and all this kind of thing. And so it's kind of like, you know, I listened to a podcast the other day. I was listening to John Hamer, and I love John Hamer when he talks about how much proof there is that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. And yet there are all these polygamy deniers right now, and that are just, they are so, like I said, they're just hanging on to their testimony with a thread. They're like, you know, and so I heard one the other day, and she was just saying, you know, Joseph Smith was a God-fearing, Bible studying, honest, good man. And I'm like, you need to do some more history. You know,
Citation needed, right? Like if you are applying those labels to Joseph Smith, show me a citation that
Yeah.
illustrates that he had those character qualities, because all that I have seen, all that is abundantly available to me is his sycophants fawning over him, or
Yeah.
people who are extremely critical of him. If
Yeah.
you choose to believe the sycophants over the people who didn't have any financial interest or any belief interest or faith interest in the church, if you choose to believe them over those other individuals, fine, you're making a value judgment about the trustability of sources. I tend to hold less weight on the statements or the testimonies or the written statements of people who had an ideological or a financial incentive to write what they did. However,
Right.
people that had no connection to the church, people who had no reason to even take notice of it, who are forced into a situation that causes them to write about it, I find them to be far more credible. Which is to say that I trust somebody like Eber D. Howe, who wrote the first critical expose of Mormonism, way more than I trust Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
Eber Howe wasn't a nice guy, but at least his research was good. At least he was honest with the facts. I don't trust Joseph Smith telling us about himself.
Well, and that goes along with the whole thing right now, where I read Juanita Brooks's, Mountain Meadows Massacre,
Yeah.
and then I'm in the middle of finishing up Will Bagley's,
Blood of
Blood
the
of the Prophet, and then I compare that to Richard Turley, and I'm like, no.
Yeah.
I'm back to Will Bagley, because I know I'm biased. I know we all have bias, but there's more. Will Bagley has got all of this historical proof backing up and quotes from this person and that person. And, and there's so much, like, Brigham Young didn't know anything about it. He didn't have anything to do with it. He was just, whittling away, and so it's like, you can't go that far. You cannot go to that extreme. You have got to incorporate some historical truth in that. And it's the same thing with Joseph Smith. So I love what you said, that one primary reason for success in Nauvoo, now like you said, we've crossed the Mississippi or the Missouri, and we're into Nauvoo, was Brigham Young and the Europe mission.
Yes.
And we talked a little bit about that, was what was happening. And again, that, like Lindsay Hansen Park, almost everything ties back into polygamy. But, to go to, word is getting out about polygamy, and their mission is so successful. And talk a little bit that we're going to get ready to wrap everything up here in a minute, but talk a little bit about why Nauvoo grew. It wasn't necessarily that, the gospel is true and the word was getting out. Why did Nauvoo increase to be the largest city in Illinois at the time?
Yeah. So we really, the sole person that we have to truly thank for this is Brigham Young, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was a financial whiz. He was a damn good businessman. And he was not many things other than a damn good businessman. And, that's something that grated on his personality, grated on him personally in Utah when he was prophet of the church, was that he was not charismatic the way that Joseph Smith was. Yeah. And I believe that he had a true unyielding love for Joseph Smith. I think the two of them genuinely did like each other and were genuinely good friends with each other. Yeah. And they were kindred scoundrels, right? They were both total monsters. But the point that I'm kind of driving at here is that Joseph Smith, like, if you track the genesis of basically any cult or most religious movements for which we have good documentation, we see that there is an originator, there is an ideas person, there is somebody who comes up with a mind-bending, whatever, and publish everything, and they're the ones who are responsible for lighting the fire. But there's somebody who has to be responsible for putting the logs back on the fire and keeping the fire burning.
Jobs and Steve Wozniak. That's you've got Steve Jobs, and then you've got Wozniak that's like, let me build it,
Yes, exactly.
And,
yes.
And it's exactly, you need them both. Yeah.
Yep. So Brigham Young was the businessman counterpart, complement to Joseph Smith's charismatic, dreamer type of drive. And so Brigham Young, Joseph Smith recognized that Europe was an untapped market. And that because, by the 1838 Missouri Mormon War, there were very few people in America who hadn't heard about Mormonism, because he had incited a civil war, right? There were national newspaper organizations who were picking up and covering the civil war that was going on in Missouri between these Mormonites and the Missourians, right? And that's also to say that, like, Joseph Smith he enjoyed some level, because he was charismatic, right? He enjoyed a quick and meteoric rise in his number of followers. And that naturally drew people to interview him and to send him letters asking him about the gospel. And that's how we have the Articles of Faith, sending them letters and asking him to write about his history. And that's how we have the different First Vision experiences or details and accounts. Right. So Joseph Smith always was kind of in the public light, and he reveled in it. He loved the public light, and he was very good at his job. Right. So by the time the end of the Missouri Mormon War, very few people in America hadn't heard about Mormonism and hadn't formed their own opinion about it, right? So that meant that most missionaries who were going to locations and proselytizing and trying to find investigators, that oftentimes they would come into a town that was already prejudiced one way or another. And there were, many exposés that were written about Mormonism too. And just like missionaries today, when they go out there and somebody stops them on the street and says, "Oh, well, your book there talks about steel swords and silk, and those things didn't exist." Well, people back then similarly knew those things because exposés had been written on Mormonism in the Book of Mormon, and those anachronisms had been stated before. And most people were, a lot of people were aware of these things when missionaries would go into town and preach, and then they would get shut out. So Europe was a totally untapped market, a blank canvas. So Joseph Smith commanded the Quorum of Apostles, which the apostles were initially, they were a missionary body. They were to go out and establish stakes of the church and basically run the church in an area where there wasn't much of a church presence that could justify having a building, a physical location. So that's what that's what the apostles did. So Joseph Smith calls the apostles to go on a trip to Europe to gain new converts. And Brigham Young is president of the Quorum of Apostles at this time, and he organizes everything. He goes out to Europe and brings 11 of the 12 apostles, and they go out and just spiderweb throughout as much of England as they possibly can. And Orson Hyde even heads down to Jerusalem and dedicates the land there. Right, that's a fairly famous story in Mormon culture. But that is to say that once they had this established, one of the very first things that Brigham Young did was he built a printing press, the Millennial Star. He started putting out publishing a periodical. He started publishing copies of the Book of Mormon, started publishing copies of the Doctrine and Covenants, getting Mormon materials out there in Europe. And that generated a new level of interest in people who had never heard about Joseph Smith or these quirky Mormonites converting to the church. And then Brigham Young did something even more brilliant. He set up a chartered ship. He had chartered a situation set up that was known as the Immigration Fund, that people would pay into a pool of money. I believe the passage would cost £4 per person to get from Liverpool all the way to Nauvoo, basically. So he established a pipeline that was funneling literally thousands of convert Mormons in Europe straight to Nauvoo, most of the way through New Orleans and up the Mississippi, right? So this brought in thousands of people from Europe, and this brought in tens of thousands of dollars in tithing money. It brought in a lot of people who would be diehard, stalwart converts to the faith, who would then move out to Utah with Brigham Young. And it just created a population, right? It created a critical mass of people who would continue to believe in the church and would spread the gospel faster than people would leave the gospel. And once a church hits that critical mass, it can't help but become a large church, or at some point it becomes a world religion. And Mormonism reached that status in the 1850s and 60s when they had this funneling effort. And so there's a whole lot of nuance. There's a lot that I'm kind of eliding over and trying to be quick and efficient with here. But that is to say that if not for Brigham Young establishing that, they wouldn't have had that cash flow and that membership injection that the church needed in Nauvoo in order to survive. The church would, not just the church, but American history would look largely different if not for Brigham Young establishing that immigration fund.
Yeah. And I know the Immigration Fund created a lot of problems because then they got to Utah and they're like, you owe us money. And they're like, well, I don't have any money, So
Yeah.
then that became a problem. And it's so, like you say, history repeating itself. So now it's the exact same thing. So now in America, there's too much out there. There's too much information out there. So they're like, well, fine, then we'll go to Africa. And
Yeah.
now Africa is where the church is growing and where they're increasing their numbers because people are too informed in the Western world. And so they have to go somewhere else. And that's just, we're seeing the exact same thing,
Yes.
where the growth is. So, well, we could go on forever. And I love that. I just think this has been so, and I hope that what I've done is given the audience a taste of what I'm talking about. I mean, to listen, I get in my car and drive around and do things just so that I can just be focused and listen to your podcast. And you haven't stopped. I'm trying to find what the heck I did with that other paper, but tell us, because I can't find it. You have not stopped podcasting. You're still
Correct.
podcasting. You're doing a podcast called Glass
Box podcast. Yes.
Okay. And
yep.
tell us about that.
Yeah, so that's my current events podcast that I do with my co-host Shannon Grover, and we basically, our tagline is that we cover current events in and out of Mormonism to see what slipped through the cracks. So we try and find something that is a missed detail or something that provide some context of Mormonism or of headlines in and out of Mormonism that provides that crucial context or that missing piece, that missing element that helps to get somebody's mind totally wrapped around the story. We also do, we review media, favorite books and movies and so on and so forth. And then we also end every episode with a happy news segment because we want to leave you with the feeling that the world isn't actually on fire. Additionally, we do long form book reviews. So we've reviewed Miracle of Forgiveness, The Naked Communist, The Case for the Book of Mormon, The Millennial Messiah, Bruce R. McConkey's most famous book, and currently we're about to finish out Saints, the Standard of Truth, the Church's history book. So we do these long form book reviews as well that are a lot of fun. My co-host and I trade back and forth of who's doing the long form review. So yeah, we just kind of do a mostly Mormon themed podcast, but we also tap into headlines that are not just only Mormon, and sometimes try and find the angle on it that is Mormon or whatever, and it's just kind of our catch-all of fun kind of current events variety type show. And then also a project that I completed a long time ago, but is relevant to the conversation here, is the My Book of Mormon podcast. The way that My Book of Mormon started was this guy, David Michael, decided he didn't know anything about Mormonism, so he was going to read the Book of Mormon. And
I listened to a few of those. Yeah.
It's a great experience because it's somebody who, he just makes, knee-jerk jokes about the Book of Mormon, and it's funny, and it gained this grassroots support movement because everyone's like, yay, someone's reading the Book of Mormon, and it's funny, right? So once David Michael got into the Doctrine and Covenants, that's when he was like, well, I want to read this, but like, I don't know what's going on here. So that's when I joined the project. And David eventually moved on because of work constraints. And then we brought in a new co-host, Marie Kent, and she and I read through the Doctrine and Covenants top to bottom, as well as the Community of Christ, formerly the RLDS Doctrine and Covenants version. We've read through a bunch of other revelations that were never canonized in the Doctrine and Covenants. So that was a really fun project because I read the earliest text of the revelation, and she read the recent or the most current version of the text, and we compared them side by side while I was also providing historical context for each of the revelations. So that was a really, really fun project. And I missed that project a lot because it was just so much fun to do. And I love the Doctrine and Covenants. I love reading that book. But yeah, and then of course the main channel is Naked Mormonism. That's a serialized history of the church.
Yeah. Now is Naked Mormonism, because I know it's not current. I mean, you ended it. You started it in what, 2014?
Correct.
And ended it in 16?
In 2020.
Oh, in 2020. Okay.
Yeah.
So so over how many episodes? Over 200 episodes.
225 episodes, I believe it is.
Yeah, that's a long time. So, but can people still do donations, or is it still actually. Okay, good.
Yeah, if people want to, I have a Patreon page, patreon.com/naked Mormonism. And actually, there's just a ton of extra content. When that show was going, I did an extra episode every Monday. So there's extra episodes, extra content, and extra long episodes. And I recorded a bunch of audiobooks, early Mormon audiobooks with commentary for Patreon subscribers. People who are watching this right now and if they want to sign up right now, you're kind of in a sweet spot because I'm not posting new material there until I get the book out, until I get my book out and published. And that's when I'll pick up the timeline and get into the succession crisis, which I hear is when the really crazy shit happens once we get out to Utah. So Naked Mormonism will continue along the chronology of Mormonism. But I got to get this book out first. So if people want to subscribe, they're in a sweet spot right now because I'm not posting anything new there. So you're not being charged for anything. But if you do subscribe, then you're getting access to all of the Patreon exclusive content, which it's literally hundreds of hours of extra content.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I'm going to definitely do that today because, like you say, I love how different historians have their different decades that they loved. And, you know, like Lindsay's like, we're getting into Utah now. And you're like, we're not doing Utah, you know, because the whole succession that's a whole nother 200, 300, 400, things, because it's just so fascinating. I mean, like you said, all we got was the sweet little story of, I don't know, one day Brigham Young said, I'm supposed to be the new prophet. And all of a sudden, the mantle of Joseph appeared on his face. And then you're hearing the new history and like, yeah, you weren't there. Oh, wait, he wasn't there? No, Orson wasn't
wasn't even there. Yeah.
And so you're like, oh, dang it. Now I got to go down that rabbit hole, I actually, Bryce, you'll love this. I have an acquaintance that we knew really well when we lived in Oregon, and she's not active in the church. Never really was active in the church. Had lots of bitching and moaning about things in the church, but she has somehow become a vigilante for the church. And she's like, "Why are you so angry? Why can't you just leave it alone? Why do you have me talk about this?" And I'm like, why do you care? First of all, and it's kind of like, this is why. It's because it's history. I mean, when you did that podcast with David Fitzgerald, who is not a member of the church, but he covers the history because the Mormon Church is a big part of American history. And so between him and even, Will Bagley and I can't remember the other author that I read that's not a member of the church. They're just like, look, this was an American catastrophe. This was the largest catastrophe. When we've got the handcart thing, Devil's Cove, and all that. Again, not a member of the church, but this is American history, and this is why it's so fascinating. And has really nothing to do with whether the church is true or isn't it true. It's just what's happening in the world, and.
That's something that I think a lot of people don't ever get to a point where they can truly appreciate, that you can study the history of Mormonism without considering the faith component of it. You can study it, you can learn it, you can research it, you can grasp these concepts without ever being a member of the church, without converting, without feeling even the draw to convert or to not convert to the church. You can study it sans any theological implications, because you're just studying the events, times and places and people, and what those events mean. And of course, where I think the theological questions come into play is when you are trying to ascertain the motivations of an individual. And this is one of the goals of history, is why did somebody do something that they did? And it's always speculative by foundation, by design. This is a speculative pursuit. However, if we see a group or a set of facts, and we see that an individual did X, we need to explain why they did that, or we need to come up with as many possible and parsimonious conclusions that we possibly can to explain why something happened the way that it did, and why it did not happen a different way, right? So the part of that is understanding the theological implications and the power of groupthink psychology and of narcissistic personalities, and how charismatic individuals work, and how population dynamics work when they are exercising this us versus them groupthink mentality, right? When you approach history with kind of a multidisciplinary perspective of seeing the psychology of it, of seeing the group dynamics that go into it, of seeing the societal benefits that go towards, or that are realized when somebody is a member of an insular community. When you understand all of these different angles, suddenly it doesn't so much become a question of, is Mormonism true? It just becomes a question of, what does the story of Mormonism teach us about humanity? And I think that's a far more provocative exercise than, is Mormonism true? That's a question that I don't care about anymore.
Right. That's beautifully stated, because that's exactly what I'm saying. Is I've lost that whole idea, is not important to me anymore. Now what I've gotten into, because it's taken me on other adventures with history, because when you start finding out this context, like say the philosophy, the way the mind works, the group think, everything that you mentioned, and then you also incorporate that into, well, tell me more about the indigenous people in this country. Oh, wait, now I'm going to go down that rabbit hole. That has nothing to do with truth, or that's just historically what happened. And now you're not like I said, now I'm obsessed with the Zion Palestine thing, and because that's more history, and so it's just a matter of finding out about the people that live on this earth, and what's happened, and how we all work, and why humanity and Homo sapiens act the way they do. And it isn't a matter of a theological belief or not. And so I love that was beautifully said. So, well, you are amazing, and I am going to continue to re-listen to Naked Mormonism, and I'm also going to get into the new one that you talked about, because that would be fascinating to look at the Doctrine and Covenants now as more historical than any kind of religious document. And so I'm going to go back and listen to that. That's fascinating.
Wonderful.
So, well, thank you for giving me your time this morning.
Well, this was absolutely my pleasure, and it was wonderful to meet you in person at Sunstone. And I was looking forward to this for quite some time, and now I'm glad that we had this opportunity. So thank you so much for inviting me and opening your platform. I know that generally Mormon history isn't what She Became Visible is all about. So I appreciate you kind of diversify, or not diverse, but opening up your platform to have Bryce come on and spew Mormon history just for fun.
Well,
this was a lot of fun for me.
As I'm expanding my knowledge, and also kind of saying that nobody, women do not exist without men in the world. So we all have to work together. And the history that you gave is talking about the strong women, what Emma did, what Lucy did, what, Annalise, Young did. All of this, there's a background story there. And unless you know the context in general, you can't even look into, when you talk about the 11 apostles going to Europe, who was man in the farm when all of these guys, who's taking care of all those kids, all those polygamous wives and whatnot. So there are women behind every single story. So I think I'm incorporating that into my She Became Visible, just to highlight the whole picture, and not just one lens, for sure.
Absolutely. Yep. Yep. I couldn't agree more. Thank you very much, René.
Well, thank you. And I was watching the news a little bit this morning. There's kind of a cold front going across the angle of the United States out there in where you're at on the East Coast. How are you doing? Are you going to get a snow?
I think it's coming for us. Yep. I'm trying to hold up. I got my warm coffee here this morning, and it feels like it's coming.
Well, and I'm a little chilly too, because I think it's 70 something here in Arizona.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I
know. We might crack into the 40s today. We'll see.
Okay. All right. Have a great weekend.
Take care.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I'm now leading you down this path, but are you not hooked? I mean, that's exactly what happens, is once you start down this historical path, unless you don't care about humanity, I guess, if that's not your thing, but it's just so important to understand the context behind all of these historical events that happened, and go back, start with one, work your all the way up to, what did he say, 220 something episodes of Naked Mormonism, and then join me on the other podcast that he was talking about, because I think I might be ready to go down the Doctrine and Covenants rabbit hole with Bryce Blackenangel now that I've done all of this other stuff. So anyway, I hope you join me. So today, It's Friday. Have a great weekend. I want to honor the veterans of the United States, even those veterans like me who sat behind a desk. I was not on a front line. My life was not in danger, although I was the only woman in the photo lab. So I don't know really. I mean, there was a battle there, but I can't say that my life was in danger. But anyway, thank you to all of the veterans who put in their time and served our country. And have a great weekend. And don't forget to stand up and be visible, announce yourself to the world, and claim your place. That's all I have to say today. So, all right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.